This is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
Hello there, welcome to this edition of Global Business Africa. In the course of the hour, we'll run through the business news stories you need to know about from Africa and beyond. But first, a quick run through the markets for you. So Nigeria's main index down for the second day in a row, closing 1.6% lower, 34,240 or so points. It's still about 28% higher so far in the quarter, not the year. The quarter. Firms like Kawando, Dangote Sugar, Honeywell Flour Mills, they've had some of the highest year-to-date gains at the bourse so far. But consider this, at less than 5%, yields on even the 7 and the 10-year bonds in the country are deep in negative territory because headline inflation is closer to 15%. That partially explains the portfolio reallocation right into equities. Now, the market cap of over $420 billion, Tesla will be the latest entry to the S&P 500 next month, following months of speculation. Its share price up over 400% so far this year and an insane price-to-earnings ratio in its wake, well over 700. Today was no different. Tesla shares up nearly 9% at 1606 GMT, $444 a piece. Here's what's coming up tonight. We'll bring you the highlights from this year's BRICS Virtual Summit. European leaders are mapping out ways to tackle climate change. And South Africa marks National Parks Week with some perks for the locals. Let's start in the world of global cooperation. China's head of state, Xi Jinping, has called on the international community to uphold multilateralism and strengthen cooperation in dealing with the COVID-19 pandemic in order to hold the global economy at large out of recession. He made those comments at this year's virtual BRICS summit.
Around the world, COVID-19 is posing a grave threat to people's life and well-being. Despite all this, we remain convinced that the theme of our times, peace and development, has not changed, and that the trend toward multipolarity and economic globalization cannot be turned around. We must keep people's welfare close to heart and pursue the vision of a community with a shared future for mankind.
In his speech, President Xi also urged that sustaining livelihoods be prioritized. He briefed the other leaders of the bloc on China's development blueprint, and he pledged the country's efforts to further integrate itself deeper into the global economy. Now, in his speech at the summit, South Africa's head of state, Cyril Ramaphosa, also addressed a whole range of issues. Here's CGTN's Angela Coppola with a summary.
Ramaphosa took an African continental view in his speech, sketching the poor state of healthcare systems and the need for more investment in science, technology and innovation. In his role as head of the African Union, Ramaphosa also endorsed the so-called New Global Deal, which included a look at the debt architecture facing most African countries and the need for affordable credit to be provided in order for it to contain the disease and rebuild economies. On the role of the new development bank, the president said the bank has a significant role to play. South Africa has already benefited, of course, to the tune of around $1 billion, and $4 billion has already been allocated to the other member countries, with another $5 billion expected. As far as the BRICS partners are concerned, Ramaphosa called for a strengthening of trade ties between the members. All continental address highlighting his dual role as South African president and head of the African Union. I'm Angelo Coppola for CGTN in Johannesburg, South Africa.
All right, then let's get some analysis of this year's virtual meeting between the heads of state of the BRIC member states. Professor Patrick Bond is part of the team at the School of Governance at the University of the Western Cape. He joins us now live from Johannesburg. Thank you very much for your time this evening, sir. So what are your initial impressions of the outcomes from today's virtual meeting?
Well, thank you very much for having me, Ramah. And I think the main thing, everyone was worried that the China-India conflict would prevent other activities from moving forward, and also the defeat of Donald Trump, with two of the BRICS leaders, Narendra Modi and Jair Bolsonaro, allied with Trump, creating more chaos. So I think the management of this has been quite extraordinary, especially because a new word has entered the BRICS lexicon, which had been actually taken off the table about 4 years ago when they met in India. And that word is counterterrorism. And there it looks like a surprise insofar as China, Russia, and India, who have hostilities with Muslim populations, have persuaded South Africa and Brazil to move in this direction. So I'm quite impressed that in spite of chaos within the underlying relationships within the BRICS and the West, they've actually pulled together a meaningful summit.
Indeed. And of course, there's a lot of potential synergy, at least on paper, between some of these BRICS members. Russia and China on one hand with their medical research abilities, India and South Africa with a vaccine development heft. Bringing all these together to deal with COVID-19 would seem like a marriage made in heaven. But that wasn't the top focus at the summit. Counterterrorism was really at the top of the agenda. This is quite the missed opportunity, isn't it?
Well, it could be if we fail to see a Russian and Chinese vaccine distributed properly. Now, we actually, ironically, have India, which is seen as the pharmacy of the third world, with especially the big company Cipla that does generics. We've had Brazil, which in the 1990s through recently was the leading state to give medicines, especially AIDS medicines. We had South Africa, with activists on the ground, sometimes against the government, demanding AIDS medicine. So if you go back 20 years, you actually have the model for how to get medicines to people who are very poor. In this case, here in South Africa, 7 million people living with HIV. The life expectancy had gone down to 52. And because of the interventions of China, a little less China, but at that point India with the Cipla, Brazil with the government program, and the activists in South Africa, they raised that from 52 to 65. I just wish that was the spirit in which the BRICS today would distribute these vaccines. And I think that's going to be tricky because, you know, they're up against the West with its high profit big pharma corps with very high technology. So this is going to be quite a contest, and the WHO is not really playing the role it needs to make a generic, you know, to release intellectual property rights on this so we can really solve this COVID-19. So you're right, it does seem like a missed opportunity at a time when we have such a great example, 20 years ago, defeating AIDS, when we had at least 3 of those other BRICS working very hard together.
Indeed, that whole IP issue is a massive conversation to be had. But let's move on to the financial side of things. The BRICS had agreed to a contingency reserve arrangement about 5 or so years ago. But now when South Africa is in a recession, its need of economic reform and foreign capital, we're not seeing any conversations around tapping into this CRA. Instead, there's talk of turning to the IMF, the same institutions that keep being criticized at these forums, for help. In that sense, the CRA is a bit of a failure, isn't it?
I have to agree, and it's a classic problem in this country and in many third world countries where you have leaders who are anti-imperialist in their rhetoric. They talk left, but then they walk right. And they walked, in this case, South Africa, right into the hands of the IMF with a request for a $4.3 billion loan in August. Now, on the other side was the BRICS Development Bank making a loan for $1 billion, but you're absolutely correct. Back in Fortaleza, 2014, when the BRICS had their summit, we thought a contingent reserve arrangement, a CRA, would be the alternative to the IMF, but it's disappeared. They said we have $100 billion in reserves, including Chinese $41 billion, $18 billion from 3 of the other BRICS, $10 billion from the poorest one, South Africa. But this has vanished right at the time of greatest need. A terrible disappointment. I must say, along with another idea from here in South Africa, Sandton Summit in 2018, that was a vaccine center we thought would be based in Johannesburg to provide vaccines and collaboration. It has also been all talk, no action. Very disappointing.
Indeed. The BRICS have often spoken about the need to reform the multilateral bodies, the World Bank, the IMF, and of course the WTO as well. Do you think that given the entry of a new administration into the White House in another 8 weeks, so we hope, might that offer an opportunity to end the gridlock we've seen in reforming the WTO? Yes and no. Certainly the WTO was one of the sites where Donald Trump was
engaged in outright sabotage. He wouldn't allow an appellate court, the judges of the WTO, to be reappointed. So it fell apart as an institution. And of course, the US and Europe had done a deal, the last big meeting, 2015, but nothing since then. And they'd split the BRICS, some of them coming in, some of them not. And what you're asking about the IMF and World Bank are also critical because the BRICS have bought in a little bit more to both institutions. In 2015, they changed the voting. 4 of the 5 BRICS got a great deal more membership. However, one of them, South Africa, actually lost 26% of its vote, and Nigeria and Venezuela lost 41%. So you had a sense 4 BRICS were moving up, but they were standing on the heads of third world countries, pushing them down. And that was not a way to transform an institution. Another example, they didn't change the leadership. When there were several opportunities, including corruption charges against the head of the IMF in 2016, they just let her stay on, Christine Lagarde. Those are some of the indications that, again, instead of being anti-imperialist, they were more sub-imperialist, working within, not against. And so you get a lot of left-wing rhetoric, but not necessarily follow-through.
Indeed, he does fall apart when he gets to the ground. One last question for you, Professor Bond. BRICS will be turning 15 next year, and it's been touted officially by its proponents as a counterweight to traditional power blocks in the West. But given everything we've discussed in the last 15 years, or rather the last 14 years, how has it really lived up to that idea?
Well, certainly not when they had the greatest chance with the decline of the West, and especially a man in the White House, Donald Trump. They call him a paleo-conservative, right? Dinosaur era, a conservative who was isolationist and destroyed every multilateral institution and important arms deal, and Iran and with the strategic nuclear, all of the things that were on the table, he simply pushed off and destroyed. And so now he's being replaced by what we could call a neoliberal, neoconservative, Joseph Biden, whose traditions are more military-industrial complex, high finance, multinational capital. I'm not sure that's a great improvement. It's an improvement, to be sure, against racism and xenophobia and the kind of macho style of Donald Trump. And especially because Trump had split the BRICS, bringing Modi, bringing Bolsonaro into his side. But what we've seen after 15 years is great hype about an alternative, but instead, when the chips are down, when it's really important to make the interventions internationally, the BRICS weren't much. They were divided. They're fighting each other on the China-India border. They're disputing all manner of ideological orientations. So it's more of a marriage of convenience of this middle layer, and they're all basically contributing to keeping a system going. So it is ultimately not a system, the BRICS as an alternative, that we can say has really worked. We're probably needing something more foundational as a break from Western-dominated and indeed capitalist-dominated values that, with climate crisis, with economic crisis, inequality, and now COVID-19 that requires such a coordinated public health approach, none of our elites out there seem to be interested in solving these.
Indeed. Professor Patrick Bond in Johannesburg, thank you for your time this evening. Now let's head over to North Africa. A delegation from the World Bank is in Cairo to review Egypt's economic policies amidst the slowdown triggered by the coronavirus pandemic. Now, the North African state, to be fair, has largely dealt with the bulk of the shocks coming out from the COVID-19 pandemic. But serious challenges still remain, and those could limit long-term growth. CGTN's Yasser Hakim has his details.
The World Bank report has commended Egypt's economic and fiscal policies during the pandemic. The North African state has succeeded in keeping growth at over 2.5%, while most of the countries in the region have witnessed major contractions. The report, however, says there are 2 main issues that need to be addressed by Cairo in order to maintain the success going forward. First is stimulating private sector activity. A sluggish private sector means low tax revenues, low foreign direct investments, and weak exports for manufacturing and non-petroleum industries.
The Ministry of Industry is undergoing several programs and changes to ease the process of establishing factories, cut on bureaucracy and red tape, and facilitate regulations. Foreign investments are currently $9 billion. The government wants to increase that amount through diversification. Among other tools, it has lately tapped into green bonds for the first time to attract investors in green and renewable energy.
Higher private sector activity would solve the second shortcoming addressed in the report, which is job creation.
في تعاون بعثة البنك الدولي الموجودة في مصر حاليا.
The World Bank delegation is working with the government to study how to support the SME sector, which is the backbone of the economy, as well as employment. The plans are aimed at expanding the sector further, even if the coronavirus pandemic remains for the long term.
The government is also working on upgrading the skills of the labor force. Training is essential, especially on technology use, to be able to produce higher quality employment opportunities. Yasser Hakim for CGTN, Cairo.
On to East Africa now, specifically Tanzania. The newly re-elected head of state of the country, John Pombe Magufuli, has laid out his priorities for the next 5 years. Among other things, he's pledging to focus on transformation of key parts of the economy while removing hurdles facing investors who want to deploy capital into that corner of East Africa. CGTN's Isaac Lucando has the details.
President John Magufuli is in Parliament to lay out his plans for the next 5 years. Big on his agenda is growing the country's economy. He says achieving his goal will require the efforts of all Tanzanians.
We need to have many Tanzanian billionaires, including parliamentarians. I want all Tanzanians to fully take part in building their country.
The president wants to see economic growth of 8% annually and 8 million jobs created over the next 5 years. He also wants to see increased domestic and foreign investment in the country's industries. To this end, the president is offering tax cuts and improvement of the country's investment climate.
There has been a lot of bureaucracy and hassle for investors and a lot of time wasting, causing them to lose hope. I want an investor with funds to get the necessary permits within 14 days.
The 2020 Doing Business report indicates that Tanzania has climbed 2 positions to the 141st position globally. But the country still lags behind its East African neighbors, Rwanda and Kenya.
According to the United Nations 2020 World Investment Report, foreign direct investment in Tanzania reached $1.1 billion in 2019, about a 5% increase from the previous year. President Magufuli hopes that attracting more investment will not only translate into the economic growth he desires, but also into better lives for ordinary Tanzanians.
Business people in the country are generally optimistic about the government's plans, but say it must address their challenges.
Most business people had the ability to travel abroad on their own to buy merchandise, but things have become difficult since the coronavirus hit, so we have to use proxies to order things, and so it is really affecting us.
If the government helps us get those investors with deep pockets, I think I can go far and reach where the president was talking about, having many billionaires. I can be among them.
I can be among them.
The road ahead for President Magufuli may not be an easy one. The World Bank projects growth of 4% this year from the previous 7% due to the effects of the coronavirus pandemic. Just how well the country navigates these hurdles to improve Tanzanian lives remains to be seen. Isaac Lucando, CGTN, Dar es Salaam.
All right, then a quick run through some company headlines. Let's start in the Republic of Congo. For the next 20 years, the Geno terminal, where all the oil from the country is stored, is going to be managed by the French oil multinational Total. The company signed an agreement with the government despite the state's initial plan to nationalize the terminal. The Republic of Congo wanted to revive the terminal, bring it up to speed, and then choose its own operators. After a standoff with global regulators, management turmoil and turnover, and a massive safety review, Boeing is close to winning US approval to resume flights of its grounded 737 MAX aircraft. But the largest US airplane maker faces headwinds from both the coronavirus pandemic but also new European tariffs as it scrambles to return that jet to service. Wednesday's decision will come as other global regulators also move a bit closer to decisions on whether or not to allow the plane to resume service. As I mentioned at the start of the hour, Tesla is going to join the S&P 500 in December. Massive win here for the chief executive of the company, Elon Reeves Musk. That boosted the electric car maker shares by 14% on Monday. It's up 9% as we speak. Now, the news does come after Musk's rocket company, SpaceX, sent 4 astronauts into space from US soil. Now, given his 20% stake in Tesla, Musk's net worth rose to $117.5 billion, according to the Bloomberg Billionaires Index. And finally, the world's second biggest smartphone seller, Huawei, is parting ways with its popular budget smartphone brand, Honor. It will be sold to a consortium of some 30 agents and dealers of the Honor phone under a new company called Shenzhen Xijing Technology. Now, a joint statement says a move was made to save Honor's industry chain, and it is the best solution to protect all stakeholders involved. That's a run through your company headlines. You're watching Global Business Africa. 20 minutes into the hour, we'll be back with more news in a few minutes.
The world economy as we know it is about to change. Global business reports highlight emerging markets, developing countries, and dynamic sectors worldwide. We feature top analysts and newsmakers to provide perspectives on every facet of business. From an on-the-ground perspective, we provide you with balanced and objective assessments. Fast, sharp, and insightful. Global Business. Only on CGTN.
Every story starts out like this.
Okay. We'll head up now.
But beyond the rush of the numbers, there's always a more fundamental question. What happened? Who has been affected? When market-moving decisions are made, who's responsible and why?
Let's get some reaction on ground. Joining us in Johannesburg is Sutra. Hello, Nairobi.
This is how all stories begin. See how they end. Only on Global Business.
There's more to this place than just glorious landscapes. There's more to it than just, say, Table Mountain or glorious, endless salt flats. There's more to it than countries that are home to some of the deepest mines in the world. There is so much more to this place, even if it is home to some of the finest diamonds on the planet. It is the sheer diversity of the people who call Southern Africa home, and the relentless drive to make it a better place that make it so special. And we know that because this too is home. No one knows Southern Africa like we do. CGTN. See the difference.
Africa is the nexus of enterprise, and Global Business will tell you why it matters.
From the mega investment projects to multi-billion-dollar mergers and acquisitions.
Africa today collects, just in terms of revenues from taxes alone, $545 billion a year. If you take 10% of that and you devote it to the energy sector, problem solved.
All this on Global Business, weekdays at this time on CGTN.
Welcome back to the program. Let's dive into the business of agriculture for a moment. KPMG and the Alliance for Green Revolution in Africa, or AGRA as it's more commonly known here, says more than 40% of agribusiness CEOs that they've surveyed this year across the continent still plan to forge ahead with their pre-COVID investment plans. The Africa Agribusiness Outlook report shows that at least 182 agribusiness executives who are surveyed across the continent have identified a range of challenges and opportunities across the sector amidst this pandemic. Managing cash flow and surviving the COVID-19 pandemic, not going out of business, these are some of the key concerns for a lot of people in this sector. Agribusinesses across the continent are also prioritizing the use of tech to better manage the fallout from the pandemic. At least 52% of the businesses surveyed say they're turning to technology like e-commerce, for instance, in order to better serve their clients and manage their supply chains across borders. Let's dig a little deeper into the details of this report. Vanessa Adams is the Vice President in charge of strategic partnerships at AGRA. That's the Alliance for Green Revolution in Africa. She joins us now via Skype here from the Kenyan capital, Nairobi. Vanessa, good to see you on the program. This survey found that for a lot of SMEs, revenues did fall by anywhere between 50 to 80%. Was all of this due to pandemic restrictions halting the flow of food from producers to their clients?
Thanks so much for having us. We're so pleased to be able to launch this fantastic effort and report. And as you can imagine, COVID has just compounded what we're seeing in terms of resilience issues. There have been climate change and locusts, you name it. So the COVID situation is really making it so much more visible and apparent, the risk to SMEs, the concern and volatility that we see across supply chains, the disruptions, of course, across borders. So the report is really the opportunity to escalate, also the need for coordination and investment from governments across Africa.
With respect to the question of low demand that some respondents are talking about, was that because of mostly a decline in incomes, i.e. spending power, or was it because a lot of households that we've seen, with a lot of small-scale farmers and households even here in Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania, they're also pivoting to actually growing their own supply for small veggies?
It's interesting. Even at my own household, we looked for local sources of supplies. Everybody that we know who was sourcing across borders was at risk of supply chain disruptions. There were tens of kilometers of trucks, as you know, waiting to have testing done and waiting to know how long it would take to get their goods across borders. But that was relatively quickly worked out from a logistical perspective, and yet the volatility, the unknowns, the changing parameters have disrupted hotels, tourism, restaurants, and so the supply chain has really become much more variable than was originally expected for anybody through this year. And we're expecting that to continue into the middle of next year, probably, while the availability of testing is relatively stable, but the vaccinations, of course, are not. But the intent of this report is really not about COVID. It just was launched, the survey, right as COVID hit. And so what happened is we were able to gather information about the impact of COVID on businesses in Africa, but also looking more broadly at what are we going to need to do in Africa to reach the Sustainable Development Goals, to reach all of our transformation strategies and plans, which every government in the region and across the continent have committed to. With the Malabo Declaration, commitments from CADP of 10% investment in agriculture. Most countries are still far from reaching these objectives, and yet they're still, as you know, in the top 4 for most heads of state.
Indeed, and we'll get to the funding bit in just a moment. But one other thing that stood out to me when I was reading the report is the fact that a lot of the survey respondents said we've switched to some sort of digital tool, be that e-commerce, talking to clients and suppliers online, doing extension services via Zoom in some instances. But given the vast digital divide that we tend to see across many African economies, how enduring can that pivot to digital really be? Because at face value, it would seem to be exclusionary to a lot of small-scale farmers.
It's so interesting that you asked that, because in 2019, the African Green Revolution Forum was focused on digitization of agriculture and food systems. And in fact, we found that there were so many solutions in the marketplace, and there are so many tools and increased uptake that the people were really primed to move to digital in COVID. It was a real and viable solution for many people. And I've actually seen village-based agents using WhatsApp to manage 1,000 customers here in Kiambu County, just outside of Nairobi. Everything from fertilizer orders and seed distribution. So every tool is actually on the table. We've seen increase of digitization of insurance and mobile payments, order taking, And we're very excited to see that there's a lot more compatibility between smartphones and traditional feature phones as well. So everybody has really pulled together, and governments, as you know, are moving to roll out their digitization strategies as well, so that the ability to do forecasting and decision making is also increasing at government levels.
Indeed. A lot of agricultural output, and you hinted to this a little earlier, a lot of it comes from small-scale farmers. But these are also the small-scale farmers who tend to be the people that banks will not lend any kind of money to. Credit access is deeply problematic for a lot of them. Other than providing a state-backed credit guarantee scheme, what else needs to be done to ensure that they have much easier access to affordable credit?
It's very interesting. Smallholder farmers in Africa appear unorganized, and yet when you dig in deeper, the supply chains are actually very well established. And so it's about aggregation. It's about capturing the value at the bottom of the pyramid, the last mile delivery. So what we've seen in AGRA over the past several years, implementing the Partnership for Inclusive Agricultural Transformation in Africa, is that smallholder farmers are actually quite ready to uptake new technologies. In fact, we have over 80% of the smallholder farmers who have access to improved seeds, fertilizers, extension techniques are actually quickly implementing improved technologies, increasing the food safety, decreasing aflatoxin levels, utilizing improved post-storage handling. And this is very, very much appreciated by the financial services. And so, as you said, the cost of credit, and that's underscored in the report, is still too high. And the transfer of the cost is actually, the smallholder farmers have no negotiating power. And yet, we do see that when there is a market, when there's aggregation, when there is year-on-year orders, as we've seen, for example, in Rwanda with Africa Improved Foods, and with UNGA in Kenya, with Silverlands in Tanzania, with poultry feed companies around the continent, there's an increased interest, commitment, even BITCO in terms of the vegetable oils to source locally. And there's a lot more willingness to source from smallholder farmers. And we're really seeing the nexus between the COVID crisis, the digital technologies availability, and the financial service sector recognizing the strength in numbers. We had Diane Karusi from Rwandan Bank of Kigali online today talking about the utilization of digitization for smallholder farmers, e-vouchers, and inputs to credit, for example, in Rwanda, which has had a transformative effect across the supply chains.
Right. One last question for you. For a lot of sub-Saharan economies, agriculture is not just forming the bulk of GDP, it's also where a lot of the jobs within those economies tend to be. And yet commercial banks historically have been very averse to get it into this sector. Agricultural lending is about 5% on average across the continent. In Kenya, somewhere around 3%. What is it that they're concerned about? Is it a lack of data on how the value chain is built out? Is it a lack of data that will allow them to visibly price risk? What's the issue there?
I do agree with you. Lack of data is a huge barrier, both for the lending sector and for the off-takers, and even for governments in terms of planning and forecasting. And the data is available, but you have to be quite nimble and creative to aggregate various disparate sources of data. Data is absolutely essential. And one of the things that we've realized is that Africa is actually very underserviced in the investment community. Only 3% of global food investments are coming into Africa. And from 21 billion of investments in the industry last year, again, 3% coming to Africa is nominal. In the last 10 years, there were only 616 million in ag-food investments in 242 deals in Africa, which is a decade worth of investments. And yet we've seen this year over $7 billion of demand for investment in 17 countries who participated with us in the deal room at the African Green Revolution Forum, which we held in September. So the demand is there, the need is there, the interest is there. And so we really are very proud to have collaborated with so many partners on this report. And we hope this will really drive up the confidence that's required to increase investment and therefore actually financing in the SMEs across the continent.
Indeed, the capital side does need to step up to the plate. Vanessa Adams from Agra, thank you very much.
Thanks so much.
Let's head over to Nigeria. Public sector workers over there may be heading over to a general strike over a recent increase in the price of petrol. The main labour union in the country, that's the Nigerian Labour Congress, has asked the government to reverse the latest price hike or face a possible strike. CGTN's Deji Badmus has that story.
It's been barely 2 months since the labour unions in the country shelved a planned strike action over a hike in electricity tariff and petrol pump price. But with the recent marginal increase in the price of petrol to around 45 cents, the unions are back on the road again. For the same reason, a statement from the leadership of the main labour union, Nigeria Labour Congress (NLC), says, quote, "The recent increase in the pump price of the premium motor spirit PMS has only exacerbated the current level of pain and anguish in the country. We condemn the recent price increase and call for its reversal with immediate effect." End of quote. The union says it was consulting with its members to decide the next line of action. But shortly after that statement from the union, the Minister of State for Petroleum called a media briefing to give reasons for the price hike and further put forward the government's position.
What we have said over and over again as a government is that government is no longer in the business of fixing pump price. That is the meaning of deregulation and stepping back from subsidy. Yes, we are very aware that this will result in some increase, but why do we have to do this? Because it is clearly impossible for government to continue to subsidize. The money is not there now. If government were to continue with subsidy, it means, for example, at some point that we may not even have money after subsidizing petrol to pay salaries.
The government and labour unions have been engaged in a long-drawn petrol subsidy battle. While the labour unions want the subsidy to remain, the government says it cannot afford it and eventually removed it in June this year. Manufacturers in the country have also backed the government's action.
We know that government can no longer maintain its refineries in operation and therefore will continue to depend on import of petroleum products. We want a situation where other private operators are encouraged to invest in the sector, to invest in refining and distribution, so that ultimately the supply will stabilize, and we are sure when that happens, the price will come down. We have seen that in all areas where deregulation has taken place.
But the labour unions are not seeing things from that perspective. They say the action will further complicate the hardship caused by the COVID-19 pandemic and rising inflation.
This particular issue has been on the table for more than 3 decades, and that the arguments have not changed. Whether it's in the name of full deregulation or it's in the name of subsidy removal, what is obvious is that it's fuel price hike. And these have further eroded the gains of the 30,000 minimum wage because it has spiral effect.
Talks are still going on between both sides to resolve the issue, but it's not looking like any side is willing to shift ground, at least not for now. Deji Badmus, CGTN, Lagos, Nigeria.
You're watching Global Business Africa. Time for a short break. Here's what's coming up. European leaders are mapping out ways to tackle climate change. We'll have the details. And fishermen in northern France are unsure about their future access to British waters post-Brexit.
Business in Africa is at a crossroads. We celebrate those who are adopting and thriving despite the challenges, from grassroots to big businesses. Global Business takes you along for the ride as we track the making of a giant.
Only on CGTN.
How will your world change today? What happens here? What happens there? Or what you make happen for yourself? If it matters to you, it matters to us too. Your stories are the stories that need to be told. Africa Live. Find your voice.
Welcome back to the program. Now, the battle against COVID-19 does also present a rather unique opportunity to invest, to go all in tackling climate change. At the 20th Annual European Business Summit, experts discussed how Europe and China can work together to meet their common goals on climate change. CGTN's Tony Waterman filed this report.
As the world combats coronavirus, some are taking the old proverb, "In a hurricane, build windmills," quite literally. Both China and Europe are striving to use their COVID-19 recoveries as a springboard into a greener, more resilient future. In the EU, nearly 30% of the COVID-19 recovery package is earmarked for green projects, while in China, President Xi Jinping has committed the country to carbon neutrality by 2060. That shared ambition was on full display at the European Business Summit on Monday.
We are clearly singing from the same hymn sheet with green, high quality and low carbon development. China and the EU still have very strong potential for cooperation and very strong synergies in the marketplace.
One area of cooperation could be around solar farms. China already dominates the world's solar panel market, but teaming up with EU firms could increase global distribution and strengthen governance.
If we work together with Europe on this, we will be able to ensure that the installation of PV stations has a much lower, perhaps even positive ecological impact. For example, installing PV generation in Africa together would not only provide power, but also jobs.
Synergies on a green transition will also be important for the Paris Climate Accord.
Europe knows that to keep the global temperature rise below 2 degrees Celsius, that China is going to have to play an outsized role. It is, after all, responsible for 27% of global greenhouse gas emissions, while Europe is responsible for 7%.
But greening industry and weaning China off coal won't happen overnight. And climate experts at the summit said Europe could lend expertise to help Beijing reach its goal.
The things we do now will dictate what we do in 30 years' time. The investment in industry, in energy, in systems, in new business models, in new ways of doing business has to take place now, not in 10 years' time. 10 years' time is too late.
The seeds of a greener future being planted in the ashes of a global pandemic.
Now, the UK is still trying to negotiate a post-Brexit trade deal with the European Union. But fishermen in northern France are now faced with a major sticking point for them over future access to British waters for their livelihoods. CGTN's Ross Cullen has that story.
Fishermen in northern France have enjoyed nearly 50 years of shared seas during Britain's membership of the European Union. But a no-deal Brexit is threatening to sink the livelihoods of people like Laurent Merlin, who's been fishing all his life.
If we don't have an agreement, it will be catastrophic.
Today's haul of flatfish and crabs will be at risk if any deal between the UK and the EU does not guarantee access to the seas of Britain.
I spend almost 10 months a year in British waters, and if they take that away, then I'm dead. In French waters, there are no more resources, so the little fish or shellfish we find is in British waters. If they take that away, it's the end. It's unimaginable. It's becoming unbearable.
Boulogne-sur-Mer was built on the sea, and fishing is a family business. Laurent's sister Valerie works at the daily fish market.
Our father is very worried, and it's hard when you see what's coming. Having given so much to get to this point and then not to go to sea anymore. I've been here for 22 years. I can't see myself doing anything else.
Residents who don't work in the fish industry still support it by coming to buy plaice, lobster and crabs.
It's going to be a disaster if we do nothing and the British maintain their position. We're not going to see the small boats leaving anymore. We'll fish in our own waters, but there's nothing left.
We have to keep fishing. Boulogne and fishing go together. They're inseparable. And it helps the economy and tourism here too.
Over the last 2 years, unemployment has been falling here, but the people of the town worry that the jobless rate will rise because so much of the economy is fishing related. So if that sector flounders, the wider town will suffer as well.
Boulogne-sur-Mer is France's largest fishing port. It's within sight of British shores, and fish from British waters is landed here every day.
The mayor of Boulogne says France and the UK have a long history as neighbours, and both countries know they need each other.
British fishermen will have to find partners, and those partners exist here. We work every day with British companies. We buy fish from them. We sell their products. You have to think about the whole sector, from the caught fish to the processed fish to the fish on the dinner table.
The problem for both sides is how to untangle the two fishing sectors which have had 47 years of shared ties. France and the UK are close geographically, and many people here are hoping they are also close to agreeing a deal that would protect fishing fleets on both sides of the channel. Ross Cullen, CGTN, Boulogne-sur-Mer, Northern France.
Let's dive into commodities of a slightly different sort, certainly not fish. The OPEC Ministerial Committee, the Monitoring Committee rather, met earlier today. They looked at an oil forecast demand for 2021, which Reuters reported was revised lower compared to October's assessment by about 4.8%. Now, the group is expecting demand of roughly 6.2 million barrels a day. Demand growth rather, 6.2 million barrels a day next year. The cartel, remember, did originally plan to raise output by 2 million barrels a day in January, but a resurgence in COVID-19 cases, particularly in big markets like Europe and the US, is raising questions about how strong energy demand really will be next year. OPEC Plus has been considering a delay in increasing output, but for how long in 2021 is yet to be determined. Brent crude up about, or rather 1% lower at 43.35 a barrel at 16.03 GMT. Here's what's coming up next. South Africa marks National Parks Week with some perks for the locals. And we'll explore how the COVID-19 pandemic might trigger a citrus crisis in Tunisia. The details coming up shortly.
Africa is a continent of diversity, with varied climate and enchanting geography, and a people so distinct, but with a shared enduring spirit. We are at the heart of the continent to bring you the untold stories.
Let's have a look.
We celebrate Africa as it shapes its own destiny.
Tunis, Cairo,
Juba,
Johannesburg, Ethiopia,
Tanzania.
Africa Live. Find your voice.
Images may appear to be identical, but looks can be deceiving. The difference is not always obvious. It has to be discovered. There are always different sides to a story. We put the focus on the details. To see more, to understand better. CGTN. See the difference.
You don't find the stories of North Africa by sitting on the sidelines. No one else will take you where we can in North Africa. And no one else will show you what it's all about. CGTN, see the difference.
Welcome back to the programme. Now, as South Africa's borders open to international travellers after several months of lockdown, tourist destinations like the world-famous Kruger National Park and other parks across the country are keen to welcome visitors like you back. This week marks the annual National Parks Week. That's when all of South Africa's national parks grant free access to the country's citizens. CGTN's Renee Delcam has that story on Grassroots.
South Africa is one of the most mega-diverse countries in the world, with over 100,000 species of animals and plants. And National Parks Week is an opportunity to celebrate and showcase the country's rich natural heritage. South Africa's National Parks Week was started back in 2006 as a way of making the country's national parks more accessible to communities who had never had the opportunity of visiting them before. Around 500,000 South Africans have benefited from the Parks Week initiative over the years.
This is really an opportunity for disadvantaged communities to visit our parks, to understand the work that we do here, and of course to enjoy the incredible beauty of these protected areas.
From the iconic Kruger National Park in the north to Africa's southernmost point at Cape Agulhas, South Africa's national parks have always been highly popular with international tourists. And SANParks, the body managing them, felt the devastating economic impact of COVID-19 when international travel restrictions were put in place earlier this year.
During level 5 lockdown, it meant complete shutdown of our tourism activities. Tourism is an engine of SANParks as we generate 80% of our operational income from tourism. Therefore, the lockdown, which was a good thing at the time to do, it meant shutdown of tourism activities.
Our parks are heavily dependent for revenue stream on international visitors. And of course, for many, many months, our international visitors could not visit. And as a result of that, we had to transfer almost R1 billion from the departmental budget to the SANParks budget, so that SANParks at the end of the year can more or less balance their books. And although our international visitors can't get in free this week, they're extremely welcome, and we do hope to see them all in large numbers soon.
It will be a matter of observing some protocols, but as we speak, South Africans are enjoying their parks. Therefore, people of the world who are waiting at the right time to welcome you.
Parks Week will run in all 19 national parks for the next week. Renee Delcam, CGTN, West Coast National Park in South Africa's Western Cape Province.
A little earlier in the hour, we spoke about the disruptions to agricultural supply chains inflicted by the COVID-19 pandemic. Here's a very specific example of how that's playing out in Tunisia. The country's 2019 and 2020 citrus harvest is facing quite a few difficulties with regards to domestic marketing, but also exports. The lack of large producers and traders to purchase and aggregate the fruit in large quantities amidst this pandemic could cause prices to collapse and lead to financial difficulties for farmers. CGTN's Adin Chouachi takes up the story.
The delegation of Beni Khaled in the governorate of Nebel is the most important citrus producing and exporting region in Tunisia. The 20,000 hectares of citrus farms in the region can produce up to 430,000 tons of this fruit.
The region has produced 325,000 tons of citrus this season, which is better than the catastrophic harvest of 267,000 last year. The failure of large producers and traders to purchase citrus fruits in large quantities could cause prices to collapse and financial difficulties for farmers.
Aounallah describes as alarming the drop in the purchase of standing citrus fruits. In fact, 80% of the harvest is usually sold by mid-November, but only 20% has been sold so far. He explains this reluctance to buy citrus fruit by the buyers in anticipation of the development of the epidemiological situation and its impact on the export operation.
As a union of agriculture and as farmers, we have our own vision of the export operation. Yes, we are facing many difficulties, especially during the pandemic, but citrus consumption is increasing in the whole world. Tunisia must seize the opportunity. Exports of Maltese orange, half-blood, which have many health benefits.
Wissam Ben Amara is a farmer in Beni Khaled in the Gabon region. He says several diseases have affected the harvest. Ben Amara also shed light on the problem of insufficient rainfall.
This is a year of drought. It has not rained for a long time and irrigation water is not available. In addition, the black spot disease distorts the size of the fruit and impacts both the harvest and exports.
Tunisian authorities have supported the citrus fruit sector with subsidies of up to 50% for air transport. However, experts have decried the increase in shipping costs during the pandemic. Exports from Tunisia to France did not exceed 7,000 tons of Maltese oranges until mid-November, while the usual rate exceeds 15,000 tons. The interprofessional fruit grouping has urged the ministries of Agriculture and Trade to promote exports to other European countries, as well as Africa and Asia. Adnan Shawishi, CGTN, Tunis.
A run through the currencies as we wrap up the program. Kenya shilling continues to slide against American dollar. It's hit about 3% against the greenback in the last 4 weeks, but it's far from being the continent's worst performing currency, even at that level. On a year-to-date basis, the bottom four include Ethiopia's birr, that's down 16%, Mozambique's metical, down 16.5%, Angola's kwanza, that's nearly 28% low, and of course Zambia's kwacha is right at the top of that table, down around 32.2%. On the crypto side, however, Bitcoin's rally since October is showing no signs of letting off. It's gone up at least 140% so far this year. It is $17,360 at 16:07 GMT. That's a run through your currencies, and that's it for this edition of Global Business Africa. As always, we'd like to hear your thoughts on the content you've seen on the program in the last hour. There are many ways to get your thoughts back to us, all of them on your screens right now. I'm Ramah Nyang in the Kenyan capital, Nairobi. Thank you for your company in the last 60 minutes. The World Today is up next from Washington, D.C.